was famed for its military prowess. But what would happen if an invading force managed to infiltrate the Eternal City? Could Rome's legions defend their homeland against a determined enemy, or would the invaders triumph over the city's defenders? Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Today we will find out how Rome fed 5,000 soldiers in enemy territory. The year is 390 BC, and the Gauls have just sacked the city of Rome. This was one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. And although the Gauls had ultimately been forced to lift the siege and withdraw from the city, they had caused massive destruction and taken many prisoners with them. Among the captured Romans were 400 senators, and Vercingetorix, the Gaulish chieftain, now held all the cards. He could demand massive ransoms for the prisoners or simply execute them. But he chose another course of action. He would use the Romans as bait to capture even more Roman soldiers. Vercingetorix's plan was simple. He would take the senators deep into Gaulish territory and then set up camp at Bibracte, a town that would later be known as the place where Rome was defeated. To lure the Romans into a trap, Vercingetorix sent word to the Roman Senate, saying that he was willing to negotiate the release of the prisoners in exchange for gold. The Romans fell for the ruse, and 5,000 well-armed soldiers set out under the command of Marcus Furius Camillus to meet with the Gauls. What they did not know was that they were walking straight into an ambush. The Roman army arrived at Bibracte to find a large Gaulish force waiting for them, and a battle quickly ensued. In the heat of the fighting, Vercingetorix's cavalry charged through the center of the Roman lines, capturing the eagles of several legions and driving the rest back to their camp. Seeing that their position was untenable, the Romans decided to flee. Vercingetorix and his men pursued them, but soon called off the chase and withdrew back to their camp. For now, the Gauls had won a great victory, and Rome was weaker than ever before. So why didn't Vercingetorix press his advantage and destroy the Roman field army? There are two possible answers. The first is that Vercingetorix simply wanted to end the war and go home. By this point, he had already acquired immense wealth and prestige by sacking Rome and holding the senators hostage. A smaller victory like this would only add to his glory, and he likely felt that the Romans would pay whatever price he demanded. The second reason is much less flattering to the Gauls. It was probably a combination of exhaustion and fear. Even though the Romans had fought poorly, they were still a formidable force, and the Gallic tribes had never faced an army like Rome's before. They had no idea how the Romans would react when reinforcements arrived. And so rather than risk total annihilation, Vercingetorix decided to end the battle and try to get as much loot as possible from the Romans. But there was one thing that Vercingetorix couldn't steal: the food supplies of the Roman camp. As soon as the battle ended, the Romans began destroying their stores of food, burning as much as they could. This meant that Vercingetorix would have to feed the captured Romans himself, and he had no choice but to treat them well if he wanted them to stay alive. Although Vercingetorix had been victorious in battle, he had actually lost on the battlefield. His army was exhausted and hungry, and he had captured thousands of prisoners who would need to be guarded at all times. At this point, the war was starting to drag on, and neither side could achieve a decisive victory. This stalemate lasted for several months until the Roman consul Gaius Marius arrived with reinforcements and drove the Gauls out of central Italy. But by that time, the damage had already been done. Rome had been humiliated, and its power in the Mediterranean was greatly diminished. So how did Rome manage to feed 5,000 soldiers in enemy territory? The answer may surprise you. During the battle, the Romans were able to salvage some food supplies from the Gauls, but these supplies were not enough to sustain the troops for very long. The Gauls had looted the Roman camp, and most of the food there had already been destroyed. However, Vercingetorix underestimated the resourcefulness of the Romans. The soldiers were able to forage for wild plants and berries, which provided them with some much-needed nutrition. They also killed fish and hunted small animals such as rabbits. These methods of acquiring food were not ideal, and the Romans were desperate for a more reliable source of sustenance. Fortunately for them, the Gauls were not expert hunters or gatherers, and the soldiers had to rely on the food that they had captured from the Romans. This meant that the Gauls were unable to completely prevent the Romans from foraging for food. The soldiers were able to find enough to eat, and this kept them alive until they were rescued by the Roman consul Gaius Marius. Overall, the Romans were able to survive in enemy territory by using their knowledge of the local environment to their advantage. They were able to forage for food and hunt small animals, which provided them with the sustenance they needed to stay alive. However, it's important to note that the Gauls did not intentionally allow the Romans to forage for food. Rather, the Gauls were not expert hunters or gatherers and were unable to prevent the Romans from finding enough food to sustain themselves. It is important to remember that the Gauls were not a single unified tribe, but rather a collection of different peoples who spoke different languages and had different cultures. Nevertheless, they were united in their opposition to Rome and their desire to drive the Romans out of their territory. Although Vercingetorix was able to defeat the Romans in battle, he was ultimately unsuccessful in his goal of ending the war and going home. The Romans were simply too powerful to be defeated so easily, and Vercingetorix and his men eventually had to withdraw from central Italy. But what happened next is often forgotten. After withdrawing from Italy, the Gauls continued to resist the Romans for decades. In fact, it wasn't until Julius Caesar came along that Rome was finally able to conquer Gaul. Although Rome was victorious in the end, it's important to remember that the Gauls were still a formidable opponent. They were fierce fighters, and they were able to hold their own against the Romans for many years. In fact, it wasn't until Julius Caesar came along that Rome was finally able to conquer Gaul. But what happened after that is often forgotten. The Gauls continued to resist the Romans for decades after Vercingetorix's death. In fact, it wasn't until Julius Caesar came along that Rome was finally able to conquer Gaul. There are several reasons why the Gauls were able to hold off the Romans for so long. First, the Gauls were a more numerous people than the Romans. This gave them a larger pool of potential soldiers to draw from. Second, the Gauls were more familiar with the terrain in which they were fighting. This gave them a significant advantage over the Romans, who were largely fighting on foreign soil. Finally, the Gauls were led by some brilliant military commanders such as Vercingetorix. Under his leadership, the Gauls were able to score some impressive victories against the Romans. Despite their military successes, however, the Gauls were ultimately defeated by Rome. One of the main reasons for this was that the Gauls were never able to unite all of their tribes under one banner. If they had been able to do this, they would have presented a much more formidable challenge to the Romans. But as it was, the various Gallic tribes were often at war with each other, and this prevented them from fielding a truly massive army. Another reason for the Gallic defeat was the eventual arrival of Julius Caesar. Caesar was a brilliant military commander who was able to defeat the Gauls in a series of decisive battles. In conclusion, the Gauls were a formidable opponent for Rome, and they were able to hold off the Romans for many years. Despite their military successes, however, the Gauls were ultimately defeated by Rome due to their inability to unite all of their tribes under one banner and the eventual arrival of Julius Caesar. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.